Mr. J D Chamberlin. We are at the library of the First Presbyterian Church. Today is March the 30th, 2006. Mr. Chamberlain, we thank you so much for coming and letting us interview you. And we know that you spent many years, 37 I believe, working for the Mooresville Tribune. So tell us about the Mooresville Tribune and your experiences with them.
The Mooresville Tribune was established by Tom McKnight, a renowned newspaper journalist and a native of Mooresville. Tom, with his friend, attorney Bob Giles, purchased a newspaper from Mr. Beam in Statesville called the News Leader. The News Leader operated for several years, and there was other papers, the Enterprise and the Rounder, and it was difficult for a small town to operate 3 different newspapers. And the partnership of Giles and McKnight was dissolved, and later Mr. McKnight purchased the Enterprise and the printing operation for commercial printing, and he established a paper prior to that known as the Mooresville Tribune. The Mooresville Tribune struggled at first, but finally became one of the most outstanding weekly newspapers in North Carolina and was presented many awards. I was associated after I came out of service in 1946, and I was with the Tribune till Mr. McKnight passed away in 1966, and at that time the paper, with an option to Leonard Sullivan and myself, we purchased the Tribune, and for 37 years I served as publisher of the Tribune, with Leonard serving in the editorial and news content of the newspaper. And at Mr. McKnight's death, the Tribune was passed to Lynn and I, and in 1986, Roy Park, who owned a chain of newspapers in Traverse and Ireland and several other counties, purchased the Tribune, and later, Park's death, another chain purchased the Tribune, and finally, the Media General, with headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, purchased the Tribune, and I retired in 1987, and Lynn retired several years later.
One of the stories that I recall that was picked up by the national news was the story of Long Sam. I know you were working at the Tribune then. Tell us about Long Sam.
The Catawba River was being changed to a lake by the Duke Power Company, and the little houses and huts and different places out on the Catawba River were being taken over, and a family known as, we knew her as a Brown girl. She became real known when Fletcher Davis, with his camera, found the family and found this pretty lovely girl sleeping behind a wood stove and ironing and washing for a number of her brothers and sisters. She was a beautiful girl, and she had aspirations for an education. Mr. McKnight took the news story and added some affirmatives to it that, when published in the newspaper, it was an outstanding column. And Case Gary on the Charlotte Observer contacted Mr. McKnight about the girl, and so they felt like that they needed to do something for the girl. But in the meantime, the name Long Sam became a national attention, and she was taken to New York and was on television, and later a textile industrious in Charlotte agreed to pay for her college education, and she became, out of a child out of a river basin, you might say, she became a teacher and taught for a number of years. And it all went back to the Tribune and the promotion of Mr. McKnight and Case Gary.
Mm-hmm. So, do you know where she is today?
She was living in Charlotte. She was retired from teaching school. She married a engineer, some guy. He was an engineer from Clemson University. Mm-hmm. They never did have any children, and she was a very public-minded young lady and was a real credit to Mooresville.
Okay. Can you recall any other unusual stories that occurred during the time that you were with the Tribune?
One story that I recall, the Mr. McKnight and the doctors in Mooresville were at odds about the doctors maintaining offices in the public hospital, Lawrence Hospital. And he started a newspaper campaign to have the doctors to move out of the hospital and to use the space for patients instead of doctor's office. The leading doctor at the Lawrence Hospital disagreed very vehemently with Mr. McKnight. Dr. Taylor, very fine surgeon. And from that time, Mr. McKnight was on his list. It was newspaper week, and the Rotary Club asked me to get a journalism professor from North Carolina, University of North Carolina, to speak for newspaper week. The professor, in his introduction and all, said he wanted to ask everybody a question. And the question was, if you operated the Mooresville Tribune, what would you do differently? And without a space of thinking, Dr. Taylor said, I would burn the damn thing.
Well, we knew how Dr. Taylor felt, didn't we? How was it finally resolved? Do you remember?
It was resolved with the doctors moving out and establishing offices, and it became a more public hospital. And went to the people who needed medical treatment.
We know you served in the Navy. Tell us, and you said you had an interesting experience in the Navy to tell us.
I was trained as a radio man and was assigned to an aircraft carrier, the USS Block Island, number 21. We did several trips carrying planes and things to Europe, and the submarines along the coast of North Carolina was sinking ships unbelievably. And the Navy decided that the way to combat this was to establish small aircraft carriers. A man in Louisiana who was building merchant ships came up with the idea of putting a flight deck on a merchant ship, and with an 888 feet flight deck was able to put many of these small carriers into the Atlantic, and was very successful in winning a victory over the submarines along the coast of North Carolina. And I was on the carrier whenever it was assigned to a team of three or four destroyers, and we spent usually 6 weeks chasing submarines, and then we would go to Casablanca for refueling and restocking, and we would go back out and would last 6 weeks operating against submarines. We had a submarine contact, and the commander of the ship said, "We will knock off fueling this morning. We will sink the submarine tonight, and we will then finish refueling the destroyer in the morning." Well, it so happened that night we contacted the submarine, and the planes immediately were flown off the carrier to try to find the submarine. And as the carrier turned into the wind to launch its planes, the submarine was sitting there with its telescope up, and when the carrier turned broadside, the submarine fired 2 torpedoes that was fatal to the Block Island, and it began to sink. The 857 crew members, with the loss of only 6 lives, were abandoned. And as I heard the order to abandon ship, I went to standing on the carrier flight deck. We were going down knotted rope into the water, and as I got on the rope, somebody kicked me as they got on top of me, and I fell into the diesel fuel, and immediately had the problem of I swallowed too much of it and became sick. And an officer was in a life raft that I had pulled out of a torpedo bomber, and we had inflated and thrown overboard. And that was probably the best thing that happened to me whenever I landed near the life raft and was pulled into the life raft. The weather was moderate, and we were in the water around 8:30 to 9 o'clock that night. As the rescue operation was in progress, the destroyers had their lights on and was picking up people. And I was on this life raft that floated past the destroyer, and that was one of the bad things that happened, because a submarine contact ensured that there might be another torpedo, and so the destroyers turned off their lights and left. And they left. There was approximately 30 people holding on to a 3-man life raft that I was in. And the water became rough. We did not know why the destroyers left and abandoned us. We were the only people out there. And so we began to worry about a submarine coming up and taking us prisoners of war. And it continued from 8:30 that night until early the next morning. And it was a very, very difficult situation. One thing that impressed me was that when the sun was shining and we were with that life raft, the language and the actions of people on that life raft were very unchristian. But 2 hours later, when the water got rough and everything was black as midnight, everybody began to be a Christian and treating their shipmates as...
Were you in the Mediterranean Sea at this point?
I was in the Atlantic Ocean at the entrance to the Mediterranean, through Gibraltar.
Okay.
We went into Casablanca for supplies and things like that.
Okay. So, and when were you finally rescued?
About 5 o'clock the next morning, they came back looking for us, a destroyer. And the chief in the life raft had taken over the management of the life raft, and he told us that we could not turn lights on, we could not yell, and that he was not going aboard a German submarine as a prisoner. Well, the little red light showed up about 5 o'clock the next day in the morning, and everybody began to talk, and he told us to be quiet, that he was giving the order. And as the red light became larger and approached towards us, he identified it as a destroyer that was looking for us. And so we turned our flashlights on and we began to yell. And the destroyer came over there, swung around, they throwed the ropes, matting on the side of the destroyer, and they came down and helped us aboard. And the destroyer turned off its lights and took us to Casablanca. When we got to Casablanca, 800 and some survivors had a difficult time finding clothes, uniforms. So they found enough army clothes to clothe us 800 and some sailors. They had no place for us to sleep. They cleaned out camel barns, and we spent a couple weeks sleeping in camel barns. The Navy was trying to keep the sinking of the Block Island secret, and they would not let us communicate with our families until about a week later. And they called us together and told us that they were going to let us contact a family or relative, and that we could only use 3 words in the telegram. And to this day, I remember those 3 words on my telegram: safe and well. When my wife received the telegram, she wouldn't open it, and she had a difficult time until her mother opened the telegram.
So she knew you were safe and well. Did you ever have any, as the time passed and the war was over and everybody went back to their homes, did you ever have any communication again with those people that you spent that time on the life raft?
I was in the communication division of approximately 50 people. I was signalman and a radioman and others under the thing, how we operated the ship. And it was interesting that a picture of the 50 some people was made. Was an 8x10, very good picture. And all of us in the communication division got one of those pictures. There was a man on the destroyer that was being refueled, had appendicitis, and he was a radioman, so they requested to borrow one of our radiomen to send the man with appendicitis over to the carrier to be operated on. Well, when we got sunk the next day, the man who was loaned to the carrier as a radioman had the only picture that survived. And I borrowed the picture and brought it to Statesville to a friend of mine, Linto Lyons, and I gave him $1 a piece for 50 more, and then was able to save the picture. And to this day, it was interesting that I saw that picture on the computer on the internet, and it was interesting. I was sitting in the coffee shop in Mooresville, and the man who operated the computer came and asked me what the name of the ship that I was on, and I told him Block Island, and he said, "Come back here." He said, "I see your picture on the computer," and that was the picture that one was saved, and I had reproduced for the 15 communications.
Mm-hmm. So somebody had put it on it. One of those 50 people, or their
Right.
children, or somebody had that picture and had put it on the internet.
They had they had formed an association, and they were meeting every year on May the 29th, because that was the day that the carrier was sunk. And I stayed in communication with several of the men who were on that ship.
What about the people that were on the raft with you during that time? Have you maintained any communication with any of them, or did you get separated
Yes,
after you got?
I had a close association with another radioman, basically because I was on the life raft because I was sick, and he was holding on to the life raft and I was in it, and I had reached down through the netting and had my hand on his belt, and the man beside him told me to get out of the life raft. He was going to get in, and the two men then became embroiled in an argument until the old chief who had taken charge made them shut up. And the man that I was holding his belt to keep him he and I became real close friends. And he was from up in Chicago.
Well, that must have been a harrowing experience. Wow.
It's still, I still have memories that come back and flash back here so much
Okay, Al, do you have any questions?
Well, I'm just curious, after you were rescued and recovered, did you go back to, I'll say, active duty or on a ship?
That's a good question. We were, they sent an aircraft carrier over there to pick us up in Casablanca and return us to Norfolk. And we were given 30 days survivor's leave. And then when I came back, I was at a Navy receiving station. And they always called people's names out when they wanted a certain one. And my name was called out and told to report to the mess hall about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I went to the mess hall, and there was one man sitting in the middle of this big mess hall, and he called me in and he told me about how bad the Germans were, and he was sure that I wanted to get even with them. And I told him, no, sir, I wasn't mad at anybody, and I didn't plan to go back out there. He realized that I was very affirmative, and he didn't say much more. And I never did figure out till about 6 months later who he was. I was transferred on a troop train with the whole crew off the aircraft carrier, and we were taken to Seattle, Washington, Bremerton, Washington. And we were waiting on a new carrier, Block Island 106. And playing basketball one day, I heard my name called out and reported to a certain office. And I went over up to the office, and the man told me, "LC, you want to talk to me?" And he told me about this new carrier. He said, "Have you seen it?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You think you're going to like it?" And I said, "Yes." And that was the mistake I made, because the psychiatrist in Norfolk that interviewed me had put into my record that I was refusing to go back. But this time I had forgotten. But whenever I told the man sitting there that there was going to be a good carrier and I was looking forward to it, he said, "Thank you." And I left, and it took me a few minutes to figure out that there was 2 psychiatrists that done me in.
What do you think would have happened if you hadn't said yes the second time?
I
have no idea.
I don't know, because
So you did go back and serve on that carrier again?
I went back and served on a new carrier that was the same name as the old carrier, but it was, and that was the only time in the Navy that they had taken an entire crew from one ship and transferred it to another. And I served on that one until the last battle at Okinawa.
Okay, was there anything else that you wanted to relate to us, Mr. Chamberlain, about your growing up, your business experiences here in Mooresville?
Well, I grew up as an adult after coming here as a orphan, and was involved with the community in a number of ways while I was working at the paper. Was interested in the Recreation Commission and served on the board of it. I was active in the Merchants Association, and eventually was president. Also was served as president of the Chamber of Commerce, and was active participation in the Ireland County Industrial Bonds Group, and am still serving as the chairman of that group.
Explain what that is.
The Industrial Bonds was an organization by the Hardin County Commissioners where they established a committee or a group to interview new businesses coming to Mooresville. And they were responsible to check the business concerning environment, also to ensure that the new business paid a premium wage over the average wages in the county. We brought many industries to Mooresville and South Ireland by working with them through industrial bonds that were basically bought by banks at a lower rate than they could get privately.
And this would encourage businesses to come to Idle County and Mooresville.
Well, basically to Mooresville.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same situation up at Statesville, in that they have an industrial recruiter up there, but the industrial recruiter in Mooresville and the industrial recruiter in Statesville go through the Hardin County industrial bonds to establish a good commercial people in the business world.
Okay, that sounds like a real bonus for Idle County. Albert?
Before we started taping this, you mentioned an interesting story about the train that used to run from Mooresville up to Taylorsville. Tell us that again, if you would.
The train we call the June bug, and it's still operating from Taylorsville to Statesville, but at that time it operated from Taylorsville to Statesville to Mooresville, and they carried freight, and they also carried passengers. It's, I think, interesting that back in 1939 that the train operated the same as we're discussing. The trains that are planned down in Charlotte to carry passengers into Charlotte on a regular schedule. I think I told you that my wife's probably 17, 18 years old, and she walked out there where the train passed her home and waved at the engineer, and he stopped, and she got on the train and carrying her guitar. And I think she said she paid a quarter to go from the other side of Statesville down to Mooresville to spend the weekend with a cousin, Edith Shook, on Liberty Street, which is near the depot in Mooresville. And on Sunday afternoon then, she took her guitar and went back to the Mooresville depot, got on the June bug, and went back to her home on the other side of Statesville as the train returned to Taylorsville. The June bug is still operating between Taylorsville and Statesville, basically as a freight train these days.
So she was an early Mooresville commuter.
You're right. Same thing as we're discussing today, which has become a group for and a group against. And it's going to be interesting what happens with the commuter train that they're discussing now.
Albert, any other questions? Okay. Anything else you want to tell us, Mr. Chamberlain?
Let's get into politics a little bit.
Okay.
Mr. McKnight was a strong Democrat. He got it up, and he operated a newspaper. And I was working at the Kinston Daily Free Press in Kinston, North Carolina. And he called me one afternoon, and he told me that his personnel were alcoholics, and he was either going to close the newspaper or he was going to have some sober employees, and he wanted me to be the first one. I thought it was interesting that Bud McKnight of No Kin was a good friend politically of Mr. McKnight, and he came to Mr. McKnight's office and said that a group in Statesville were coming down to have dinner together, and that he wanted Tom McKnight to come to the dinner, not knowing what the group had in mind. They met, and the discussion was that the Republicans had taken over the Democrats, and they decided that the only way that our county could get a Democrat back in the Assembly was for Tom McKnight and Mr. Huskins, J. Huskins of the Statesville paper, to agree to support a Democrat for the state legislature. Tom, not knowing who the people wanted to support, he agreed. And then they told Mr. McKnight that the person they wanted to support was J. Huskins, who was not a friend of Mr. McKnight's. Mr. McKnight was in a quandary, and returning from the lunch, he came into the shop at the Tribune and walked up behind me, and I could tell he had something on his mind. And I turned around to speak to him, and he said, JD, I want to make a confession. And I said, well, that's up to you. He says, I'm going to tell you that I went to bed with Jay Huskins.
Oh, me. And did he support Jay Huskins?
He supported Jay, but like I say, he kept his promise.
Yes.
And
Where was Tom McKnight's home? Where did he live?
he came here with his parents from Montana somewhere, and he was an only child. His mother was a dedicated teacher, and his father was a banker. I think his father worked at for Old First National Bank on Main Street in Mooresville. And his mother was a teacher, and Tom was an only child. And he was a normal teenager. And I'd like to tell you what I said normal. He told and laughed about it that Halloween, he and a group of teens got together, and they were up to something. And the next morning after Halloween, a two-horse wagon was sitting up on the crest of the home nearby. Nobody could figure out how that wagon showed up on the roof of this home. And I said, well, Tom, how did it happen? He said, well, we spent about a week taking it apart. And we carried it out there, a wheel and a piece of time. And he said that nobody in town could figure out how that wagon got on the house at Halloween.
Anything else you'd like to tell us?
Well, another incident that I remember distinctly. The young people, teenagers in Mooresville, spent their recreation hours out in the muddy Catawba River. But Mooresville, at that time, he had built a swimming pool at the War Memorial. But the Ministerial Association were very skittish about the swimming pool, and they did not want it opened on Sunday. And Mr. McKnight was an Episcopalian, and his pastor came to him and said that the Ministerial Association asked all of the ministers to vote not to let the young people in Mooresville swim in the swimming pool on Sunday. Mr. McKnight's pastor came to him and told him that the ministers had asked him, since he was the only one that voted against the swimming on Sunday, he didn't like making the teenagers go back to the muddy Catawba River. But the other ministers asked him to abstain so that they could say it was 100%. Well, Mr. McKnight found out about this, and he wrote a stinging story or editorial about the ministers and not being open and honest about the swimming pool. And the president of the Ministerial Association happened to be my pastor. Well, he called Mr. McKnight after the story came out and very upset about the ministers being untrue to their faith, not being honest with their church people. And after the minister talked to Mr. McKnight a little bit, trying to get him changed, Mr. McKnight says, well, I'll agree with you. He says the Mooresville Tribune is my way of communicating. Your pulpit is your way of communicating with the people here. He said, you say what you want to in your pulpit, and I'll say what I want to in the Mooresville Tribune. Tom was a little bit concerned what he had said to my pastor. And the next, he come out of his office, and the other minister left, and he looked at me and he says, JD, I just disagreed with your pastor. But he said, I want to tell you, he said, you Baptists are so fundamentally wrong. He says, when a group of you get together, he says it's difficult to change their mind. But he said that all of you Baptists have to sleep 7 to the bed when you have a convention. You're so narrow.
Something that you said triggered something in my mind. The Tribune has always had this little saying on the editorial page, although I disagree with you, I will always defend your right to say it. Did Mr. McKnight start that? Did he?
He did. It was a statement, I believe I remember correctly, Voltaire, which goes way back. And he practiced that. He was very strong that the well-known people in town weren't the only ones that should be treated fairly. I remember one time I asked him, the Statesville people carried the arrest of the drunk drivers and all, and I asked Mr. McKnight, and I didn't see no problem with it, and I asked him why the Tribune didn't carry that information. And Tom says, if I carried the arrest and didn't carry the court results, he says, well, some of those people are not guilty. He said, I'm not going to print any of it because we can't keep up with who's guilty and who is not. He said, particularly the people who wear blue denim shirts and overalls are treated unfairly, and I'm not going to be a party to it.
So he had certainly had moral principles that he believed in and stuff too.
Yeah. Another thing, we're talking about different things. One of the things that I saw in the old movie of Mooresville, and I was in that old movie in 1939 as a young line-tape operator printer in the building where Gibson Brothers Furniture is on Main Street. And the old movie was made by a gentleman from Lexington who traveled from town to town making movies on a 16 millimeter projector for a 16 millimeter. And I've seen a number of his movies. In fact, I have a copy of the movie that I was in as an 18-year-old here in Mooresville. But the thing that impressed me was the people who worked in the mill. As you looked at that picture, these people coming out of the mill, all of the men were lighting up cigarettes, and all the women were taking their snuff and putting it in their mouth. And that was a tough life that those people lived.
Okay, anything else you want to relate that you can think about?
Well, I think that I need to stop telling these.
Well, we do appreciate your stories, and particularly the stories about Mr. McKnight, because those are, you knew him well, you worked for him so long, and he certainly was an influential person in Mooresville for a long time.
Let me tell one more little story on Mr. McKnight.
Okay.
Mr. McKnight went to New York and was a young journalist up there. And while he was in New York, he wrote down 8 questions and mailed them to the football coach at Notre Dame. I don't recall his name right now, and asked the coach to answer those questions and forward them back to him. And he took those 10 questions and wrote an outstanding story and was awarded for doing that interview with the coach of Notre Dame, and he hadn't left his office at all. But he had a friend that he was telling me about that lived over in Brooklyn, I believe it was. And he went over to see his friend every once in a while, and his friend had the same problem that he did, was alcohol. But he said the friend who was Tom Wolfe, the well-known author of several books and was a great writer, was living there in this, he called it a cold water flat. And he went up to see him, and he said that Tom was sitting there and said there was plates with eggs on it, where the lady that he rented from would bring him a egg sandwich or something, and he said he had a bowl there, and he didn't use a typewriter. He used these penny pencils we referred to, and he used them and sharpened them down, and he had a dish of little nubs of penny pencils. And Tom said that he recognized that he was a great writer and that he was a great friend of his. And like I mentioned, both of them had alcohol problems. But Tom went on to become a sports for the University of Alabama football team. And the assembly in Alabama did not allow the football team to hire boosters. And so they hired Tom McKnight as a professor of Spanish and languages or something. And the football team was very successful. And I believe it was in 1928 or 29, they went to the Rose Bowl. And Tom was told to go to California and promote the Alabama football team in the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day. And Tom said that was the only job he had at that time that was, he said, I think he's making about $10,000 a year. And he went out there, he became drunk, and he missed the game, and he got fired. And because of another thing I'm talking about Tom, he wasn't a very good golfer. And he told me about all these coaches that are well known now, Jess Neely and the coach at Duke and several who were his friends. And they'd get him out on the golf course, and they would get their share of the $10,000. He said he got tired of it, so he secretively hired a golfer to teach him to play golf. And so when he went back, he said that he got a lot of his $10,000 back after he took the golf lessons.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chamberlain, for your stories about the newspaper and your experiences in the Navy. We do appreciate everything that you have told us, and we appreciate your allowing us to interview you.